Stephen, thanks for sitting down with me today. I appreciate your time.
It's my pleasure.
Stephen, congratulations on winning NAPB's Lifetime Achievement Award. That's quite an honor to be recognized by your peers.
It is. I'm very grateful.
Much of your work is focused on cereals, wheat, barley, triticale. Can you talk a little bit about why is it so important that we stay focused on these crops that maybe haven't quite had the attention that they've deserved over the years?
Well, I would say wheat probably has had the attention in Europe, more so than in the U.S., where they have a very vibrant private sector. Certainly internationally, wheat's been well received. It's 20% of the world's protein. It supplies 20% of the world's calories. So when you have 1/5 of the protein that humans consume and 1/5 of its calories, it's well received. Barley is probably best known for beer. Benjamin Franklin, I think, said that beer is proof that God loves us. And so I think, what the heck, that's not a bad thing. Triticale, I remember first hearing it on Star Trek, and it's now coming onto its own. I just think we need diversity, and we need our staple crops, the ones that feed us. That's wheat, and man does not live by bread alone. You need things like beer, you need things like barley. I think for our agriculture, we need things like triticale.
Agreed. Lots of changes in the wheat breeding in North America, I think, are coming. I think that would be safe to say. More privatization, more private investment.
Right.
How close are we to hybrid wheat, and what kind of needs to happen for those triggers to all fall into place?
Well, I would say there's a couple of things. First of all, how close are we to hybrid wheat? You really have to talk to the industry to know. They're the ones, they all have their timelines. They have strict budgets that they're hoping for, and they're the ones that can tell you that. What needs to happen for hybrid wheat, I think, are a couple of things. I sit on the board of trustees of Erie, and for 30 years people worked in the wilderness on hybrid rice. And now it's on something like 17 million hectares. And there never was a public sector investment in hybrid wheat the way there was in hybrid rice. And these long-term investments, the same way that we talk about hybrid rice, the quality protein maize. I can tell you a number of times where programs were told they should close their doors, they should give it up, and they stayed on. What we're going to need in the public sector, I think, is a foundational program to build the basis for hybrid wheat. And they'll have to partner with industry because they're the only ones that are going to develop the hybrid wheats and bring it to market.
Wheat's been a primary focus for you, as you mentioned. You've been working for 20 some years?
Actually close to 40.
40 years. 40 years.
Since 1976.
40 years. Good work.
Well, it's been fun.
That's a good shift.
Yeah, it is. It is. 3 different places, but it's been 40 years.
Right. Can you tell us a little bit about some of the characteristics that you're working on breeding towards regionally, and then how also does that impact globally?
Okay. Well, for Nebraska, there are 4 traits that we must have. It must survive our winter, because we're winter wheat. It must have stem rust resistance. Now, that's the biblical plague of Moses. It's rare, but we want to keep it rare. When it comes, it's like lighting a match in a fireworks plant. It's devastating. It must have good agronomics, the yield, the quality, the yield and standability, that type of thing. And it must make a good loaf of bread, or now noodles. So those are the 4 things we have to do. And Nebraska's contribution to the global wheat enterprise is we probably have some of the most winter hardy wheats. So that goes right into West Asia, where they need winter hardiness. We have very good stem rust resistance. Our end use quality is good. Our agronomics, that's always based on where you are, things like that. And that also is what happens with barley and triticale. We are probably among the world's best for winter hardiness in barley. And so as barley expands or contracts, but it moves into new areas, our germplasm becomes extremely valuable to other people.
You also teach courses at the university, and I guess I'm trying to understand. I get a lot of questions from young plant breeders about advice or thoughts or directions that they should be thinking about. What would your advice be?
Well, if you're going to go anywhere as a plant breeder, the first thing you have to do is do your job. I don't care how rich the company is or how large the university is. They have hired you for one purpose. Do it. Okay, that's the first thing. If you're going to go...
What's the purpose?
Well, the purpose is whatever your job description requires.
Gotcha. Okay.
So if you're hired to breed wheat, barley, and triticale, breed wheat, barley, and triticale. You know, don't decide you're going to go work in Arabidopsis unless you can explain why. You know, that's usually in agriculture. You have a fixed focus, and you should make sure you do what they expect. When I tell students to go into industry, they're interested in that, and a lot of them are there, and we appreciate it immensely. They need to be able to speak the language of business. They should be able to know what depreciation is, the same way as they would know what additive genetic variance is. They need to know what return on investment is. They're going to work with teams that have different perspectives than an academic would have. Know the language of your team. Be able to communicate. Everything comes down to communication, basically.
No matter what business you're in.
Exactly. I mean, you have to sell yourself, you have to sell your ideas, you have to fight for them, you have to communicate, you have to be convincing.
How do we get more folks interested in plant breeding? How do we get, I mean, and I'm sure you've been asked this question many times over the last number of years, but what do we have to do to attract the best and brightest?
Well, there's two things. One is we have to tell our story, of course, okay? You know, I look back at my career. I came out of Harvard with a BA, went to Purdue. I wouldn't trade it for anything. The doors it's opened, the places I've been, the things I've been able to do have just been phenomenal. So we have to tell our story. It's helpful when we have great leaders. You know, I'm one of the ones that came in when Norm Borlaug had just won the Nobel Prize. You know, I left high school in '69 and we expected massive famines. Green Revolution occurred and never happened. We have to have those kinds of people, the visionaries. And I think that's going to happen more frequently in the future because food is becoming a pressing issue. Norm made a comment that the Green Revolution would buy us about 30 years, and we've lived on it for now probably 40 to 45. Well, it's coming back. We're going to need that second Green Revolution. So I think the need will be obvious. That'll bring it in. The second thing we have to do is we have to create career paths where people want to do what you do. And I was surprised. I've been to a lot of universities. A lot of people have talked to me about, you know, I want to be a plant breeder. And I ask, how many want to be an academic plant breeder? And I've worked 30 years in academia, almost. I've worked 3 years in industry, and I've worked almost 7 to 8 years in the USDA, the federal sector. I like being in academia. And when I ask that question, out of maybe 20 students, only 2 or 3 hands go up. And it hurts, to be honest with you, that we have created, you know, a field that I love, in a role that I love, and yet we have not made the sale to students that the only thing they've probably ever seen is really academia. And we've got to figure out how to make better careers so these people are excited about what they can do.
Well, based on that answer, Stephen, I think part of it would be getting you in front of some of these people because, I mean, let's face it, passion is infectious.
Oh yeah,
and
absolutely.
if we can portray that passion, I think that's what draws the best and brightest in.
Well, and I think people underestimate. You know, when I went to Harvard, 1/3 went to law school, 1/3 went to medical school, and 1/3 went to business school.
Right.
Of the third that went to law school, they completed their law degree, and 7 years later, so it'd be 10 years after, 1/3 were not practicing law in any form. I think people have always looked at the medical sciences as saving the world. Well, when you look at Norm Borlaug, 1 billion people are alive today that probably wouldn't be. That's pretty hard to do. You know, a friend of mine once met a person who was very proud. They had brought vaccines to the Philippines and was really great about, you know, man, we're curing this disease, may have been smallpox or polio or one of the eradication campaigns. And then looked over to her and said, and what do you do? And she looked back and said, well, you know all those people's lives you saved? I make sure they eat 3 times a day, every day. That's not a bad answer.
It's a great answer. That needs to be told a lot more.
Absolutely.
Right. Can you talk a little bit about some of the improvements, some of the concepts that are underway, specifically in improving barley and triticale?
Well, in barley, what's happened is it's being pushed out of its, its traditional areas, which are the spring wheat, spring barley areas, due to diseases. And so now there's a resurrection of interest in winter barley because we think it'll have a climate that will avoid those diseases. So some of the changes that are occurring there are basically changing the crop structure. Moving it from a spring grain to a winter grain. That's a big tradition. Triticale is a completely different crop. It's a human-made crop. It was first developed about 1870. There was no history prior to that. So we've had maybe 140 years. And we're still finding a home for it, but it looks like it has tremendous uses in cover crops. It has tremendous uses for biomass, forage. It has tremendous uses as a feed grain. And so it's evolving into a really nice utility crop, you might say. It can do a lot of different things. So those are really interesting things to see how they're going to progress.
Things have changed since, what do we say, 40 years?
40 years, 1976.
76?
So I got the PhD in 75, first job in 76.
Right. So things have changed since then. What do you see as the biggest changes that have happened since 1976? And what do you see as the future of plant breeding?
Okay, well, let me answer it slightly differently. Okay? The biggest thing that stayed the same is the vision. Okay? Feeding people, number one. And then thinking about how to do that. The questions you ask, they really haven't changed. What's changed massively are the tools. And this is the part that I think people often forget. They think of plant breeding as maybe old tech. Every tractor I have now is GPSed. Every planter trips by a satellite. We're now sequencing 2,000 lines a year, so we can get our molecular markers. When we do a diversity study, we have 16,000 markers out of many, many more markers, but those are just the ones that look good for us to work with. Our combines have weigh systems on them, and in the future they'll probably be able to take not only yield and moisture and test weight, but probably protein, and they may be able to do micronutrients. So if you're going to fortify things like this, there's just a wealth of that. I remember, this sounds crazy, I remember when I worked with a computer, it had a 4K RAM, 4 kilobyte RAM, not megabyte, kilobyte, okay? And we had to use cards. I remember when there were manual calculators where you could do 9x9 lattices. And now, your smartphone can do more than all of that, okay? So the technology, the tools, the ability, the speed with which we can work has been amazing. And then the networking, we're working basically as a program at a university. If you were working in industry, the inventory, so that you make a cross in Indiana and someone in Brasilia says, I'd like to get that cross. And they can do it instantaneously. Their combines, they cut. They immediately upload the data. You finish that day, by the time you come in the morning, it's all analyzed and delivered back to you. The highest tech jobs in many parts of the world are now agricultural jobs. It was funny, they had on NPR, they had a big story about high-tech jobs in Tennessee. And it was a bear crop science cotton breeding station, I believe.
Yep.
And it was just unbelievable what they're able to do.
And that takes our best and brightest to be able to work in that environment.
Oh, absolutely,
yeah.
Absolutely. And it's the kind of environment that the best and brightest deserve.
Agreed. Stephen, if I'm not mistaken, you might have a red maple leaf in your background?
That is correct.
That is true. Where are you originally from?
I was originally from Toronto.
From Toronto.
And for my Canadian colleagues that are familiar with Toronto, I was born in Toronto Western General Hospital, which must have at that time had the one maternity ward, because everybody I know has come from there. And we moved to the States when I was very young, okay. And I've grown up in the States, but I am a proud immigrant. I like to say I am an American by choice and a Canadian by birth, and I honor both histories and both trajectories.
Good for you. I get to play in both areas quite a lot as well, and I think you chose two pretty good ones.
Well, you can't choose your birth home, but that was very fortunate. And as Senator Kerry used to say, to grow up in America is the luck of the womb, and it really is. I mean, it's to have the opportunities when you think of all the foreign students I've trained and how rare and few they are to get here to get educated. We have the luck of the womb.
Well said. That's a great note to finish on. Thanks again for sitting down with me, Stephen. I appreciate it.
It's my absolute pleasure. Thank you now, Shawn.